Picture the sun-drenched hills of Sicily in August 1943. Victory was in the air, and for Eisenhower it was his finest hour. He was at the absolute top, the hero who had just delivered an entire island. But as the world celebrated, a dark shadow was creeping into his headquarters. Inside his tent, a report arrived that made his blood run cold right then. It was the kind of news that turns a triumph into a total nightmare instantly. His most brilliant general, George S. Patton, had just crossed a forbidden line. It wasn't a mistake on the battlefield or a failure of complex military strategy. This was something much more personal and far more toxic to the soul. In a moment of blind rage, Patton struck one of his own men. The legendary lion of the army turned his claws on his own pride. Eisenhower knew that this single act could ruin everything they had built. It's the ultimate paradox that many powerful leaders eventually have to face. Here was a man who had just won a campaign of legendary proportions. Yet, in his arrogance, he handed his own head to his enemies on a platter. He gave his critics the very weapon they needed to destroy his career. For Eisenhower, the victory suddenly had a bitter metallic taste of disaster. He was holding a ticking time bomb that was about to explode in the public eye. A silent panic began to ripple through the higher-ups in the Allied command. If the American public found out, the outcry would be absolutely deafening. Eisenhower looked at the report and saw more than just a simple disciplinary issue. He saw a scandal that could tear the entire Allied coalition right apart. He knew he had to act fast, and he had to do it in total, absolute secret. Something was being drafted in the shadows that no one was supposed to see. Imagine the heavy, stifling air inside a Sicilian field hospital tent. It was a place meant for healing, filled with the groans of the wounded. George Patton walked in, expecting to see heroes who bled for the flag. Instead, he found a young private sitting there with no visible scars. To Patton, this was a stain on the honor of the entire Third Army. The silence was shattered when the general's hand struck the boy's face. For Patton, this wasn't just an outburst. It was a matter of principle. He truly believed he was applying tough love to a shivering coward. In his mind, a soldier without a wound was a soldier who had quit. He didn't realize that the invisible wounds of war are often the deepest. His old-school fury blinded him to the changing world around him. That slap would soon echo much louder than any artillery barrage. The doctors in that tent watched in a state of absolute frozen horror. They knew what the general didn't, that shell shock was a real casualty. The boy wasn't a coward. He was a mind pushed past its breaking point. A report was drafted, detailing a commander who had lost his own control. This wasn't just a military infraction, it was a profound moral failure. And if this report reached the wrong hands, Patton was finished forever. The secret was so toxic it could have burned down the entire Allied cause. Eisenhower knew the American press would have a field day with the story. They would call for Patton's head, and the politicians would surely agree. Ike was trapped between his duty to the law and his need for a winner. He sat at his desk, staring at the blank paper with a heavy, dark heart. A private message was being born, one that would change the rules of power. Deep in the shadows of the command tent, Eisenhower reached for his pen. This wasn't an official reprimand to be filed in some dusty, cold cabinet. No, it was a deeply personal message, a letter never meant for public eyes, Ike knew that if he followed the rules, he'd have to court-martial his friend. But he also knew that without Patton, the war in Europe might never end. So he chose the path of the secret, a decision made in total heavy silence. The ink on the paper carried a tone that was icy, almost terrifyingly calm. It wasn't a warm note between old comrades in arms sharing a drink. Eisenhower laid out a cold ultimatum that left Patton with no room to breathe. He told him his conduct was despicable and beneath the dignity of a general. He made it clear that one more slip would be the end of his career forever. The letter was a lifeline, but it was wrapped in a very sharp, jagged blade. At that moment, Eisenhower stopped being just a judge and became a protector. He wasn't protecting Patton the man, but Patton, the lethal military weapon. He saw the bigger picture that the angry public back home would never see. To win the war, he needed the monster that everyone else wanted to chain. So he began the delicate work of burying the incident deep in the archives. The root of the cover-up was planted right there in that one single page. Ike knew that a letter alone wouldn't be enough to keep the truth buried. He had to manage the narrative before it managed to destroy the army. The silence he demanded from Patton was only the first part of the plan. But there were others who knew the truth, and they were ready to talk. The press was already sniffing around the hospital tents for a big scoop. Something had to be done to seal the lips of the men with the cameras. Imagine a small, smoke-filled room, crowded with the world's top war reporters. Eisenhower didn't call them there to give a briefing on troop movements. He stood before them, looking every bit of his 52 years of age. It wasn't a command. It was a desperate personal plea from a man at his limit. He laid the cards on the table about what had happened in those hospital tents. Ike was asking for the impossible. He was asking the press to stay silent. He told them that George Patton was a flawed man, but a vital one. "I cannot win this war without him," he reportedly told the silent room. He didn't try to hide the shame or make excuses for the general's rage. Instead, he appealed to their sense of duty to the young men on the front. If the story broke, the public would demand Patton's immediate removal. And without Patton, Eisenhower knew the casualty lists would only get longer. The reporters looked at one another, their pens hovering over their notebooks. These were men whose entire careers were built on finding and telling the truth. But as they looked at Eisenhower, they saw the crushing weight on his shoulders. They realized that the truth in this case might actually cost thousands of lives. In a moment that seems almost unthinkable in our modern world today, every single one of them agreed to keep the slap a total, absolute secret. The secret was safe for now, buried under a pact of professional honor. But Eisenhower knew that Patton couldn't just walk away without a lesson. The public might not know, but the army certainly felt the cold tension. A general who strikes his own men cannot simply keep his head held high. Ike was about to demand a penance that would cut deeper than any court-martial. A new kind of shadow was falling over the man who thought he was a king. Eisenhower knew that a secret letter alone wasn't enough to heal the army. He demanded a price that Patton's massive ego would find almost unbearable. The general was forced to stand before every division he had once led. He had to look his men in the eye and offer a public, humbling apology. For a man who lived for glory, this was a slow, painful spiritual death. The lion of the army was being broken right in front of his own pride. But the humiliation didn't stop at a few speeches on the dusty Sicilian ground. Ike decided to turn Patton into a ghost general, a man without a mission, while Montgomery was given the spotlight to lead the next big Allied push. Patton was sent away to England, hidden from the world and the headlines. He was no longer the spearhead of the invasion. He was a man in exile. The general felt like he had been buried alive while the war went on. In the quiet rooms of his English headquarters, Patton was absolutely boiling. He felt like his career had been permanently erased by a single moment of rage. Eisenhower purposely ignored his constant pleas for a new combat command. Ike needed the public to see that Patton was being properly punished for the slap. The political fallout was simply too fresh to risk putting him back in the fight. The legendary commander was now just a name spoken in hushed, dark tones. Yet Eisenhower was playing a much deeper game than anyone else realized. He wasn't just punishing Patton, he was transforming him into a secret weapon. By keeping him in the shadows, he created a mystery that haunted the enemy. Ike chose to sacrifice Patton's immediate glory for a future strategic gamble. The Ghost General was being prepared for a role that would save the world. A new presence was emerging, one that would soon haunt the German High Command. While the world's eyes were on Montgomery's next move, Patton sat in exile. Eisenhower had stationed him in a quiet corner of the English countryside. To any outsider, it looked like the great general's career had truly ended. He was left with a phantom command, leading an army made of rubber tanks. Patton was absolutely livid, pacing his office like a caged, wounded predator. He felt like Ike had buried his future just to keep a political peace. But across the English Channel, the German High Command was watching closely. They didn't see a man in disgrace. They saw the most dangerous Allied leader. To the Nazis, Patton was the only general capable of a lightning-fast strike. They couldn't imagine Eisenhower would ever leave his best weapon on the shelf. They tracked every radio signal and every rumor of where he might be staying. The silence from Sicily had only made the myth of Patton grow even larger. Eisenhower realized that the dark secret of Sicily had given him a gift. Since the public knew nothing, he could use Patton as the ultimate decoy. He placed him at the head of a fake army aimed straight at Pas-de-Calais. The slap in the hospital tent became the shield for the greatest lie ever told. Ike was gambling everything on the fact that the Germans would follow the bait. He was using Patton's thirst for glory to distract the eyes of a whole nation. As the clock ticked down to the invasion, the tension was nearly unbearable. The Germans moved their best panzer divisions to meet the ghost they feared. They were staring directly at Patton, waiting for the blow that would never come. Eisenhower's secret pact with the press was now paying off in thousands of lives. The Ghost General was doing more damage from England than he ever could alone. But the truth was still waiting in the dark, ready for the final revelation. In the end, history doesn't just remember the bullets that found their mark. It holds onto the weight of the souls who stood still at the final limit. What happened between Eisenhower and Patton wasn't a failure of tactics. It was something deeper, a choice born within the commander's own soul. When we look back, we see a man who chose the hardest path of all. He traded a clean conscience for the security of an uncertain future. The world rarely offers its deepest respect to the leaders who hesitate. There is a brutal truth that the powerful try to avoid at any cost. Destiny does not wait for those who need constant approval or smiles. Eisenhower tried to save the mission and almost lost his own peace. He believed that managing a monster was the key to holding the world. But real glory belongs only to those who dare to be absolutely practical. By burying the fires of Sicily, he prevented an era of total darkness. The freedom of Europe wasn't just built on tanks and cold steel. It was cemented by the silence of a man standing alone with a secret. Ike's strategic lie allowed a broken world to find its way back home. Thousands of lives were shaped by that one letter sent in the dark. The cost of not being moral was paid for in the currency of victory. Life and war share a rule that is as cruel as it is incredibly silent. When you have the chance for a final victory, you act without fear. Any moment of doubt can turn into decades of haunting, heavy regret. Eisenhower carried the weight of that private pact until his last day. He left us a lesson that still echoes under our skin in the modern age. But there is something even deeper hidden beneath this famous